Hey there. Tonight we're heading into the cold. Not the kind that makes you shiver under a blanket, but the kind that seeps into the bones of history. The kind that kills quietly. The kind that settles over a village like a second sky. This is winter in the Middle Ages. Not romantic, not silent and picturesque, but brutal, long and hungry. Snowdrifts against wattle walls, frozen wells, mud turned to iron, nights so long you forget what the sun looks like, and somehow peasants survived it. Not with comfort, not with ease, but with 1,000 hard-earned tricks passed down through generations. Small rituals, bitter vegetables, shared heat, quiet desperation. That's what we're uncovering tonight. Not the glory of medieval life, but the grit. So if this kind of slow, immersive history helps you relax or fall asleep, feel free to like the video and subscribe. And if you're still listening by the end, let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what the weather is like right now. There's something peaceful about knowing we're all listening to the same quiet story, scattered across the world, warmed by the same fire of memory. So, settle in, pull the blankets up, and let's walk into the cold, hand in hand with those who knew it best. Let's begin. The first frost and the final harvest. It begins quietly, a thin sheen on the edges of leaves, a brittle snap beneath bare feet before the sun rises, a stillness in the trees, not silent, just paused, listening. The first frost doesn't kill, but it warns. For a medieval peasant, that warning meant one thing: move. Get the last of the root vegetables from the soil, pull the leeks, strip the cabbages, dig the turnips before the ground locks them away for good. There's no calendar on the wall, no weather forecast, just instinct, memory, the taste of air when it turns dry and metal sharp. Everyone knows what comes next. The harvest isn't a celebration, not here, it's a race. Every hand is needed, children, elders, the lame and the quiet. Because whatever doesn't come inside now won't make it. Carrots are pulled, not cleaned, just packed in straw and piled in pits. Potatoes, if you have them, are buried deep under soil, safe from frost fingers. Apples are sorted, bruised ones eaten now, perfect ones stored in cool corners of the hut, wrapped in old cloth or bark. Grain? That's already inside if you're lucky. Barley, oats, rye, measured by handfuls, not sacks. If the rats haven't found them, you'll have porridge through February. Everything is preserved somehow. Salted, dried, smoked, fermented, hung from beams or buried beneath the floorboards. Because the firewood might run out, but the cold never will. You don't eat fresh anymore. You ration, and you pray the roof doesn't leak when the snow comes. The fool in the village calls this the season of the hollow belly. He's not wrong. The frost is only the first reminder. The real threat is 3 weeks away, then 3 months more. But for now, the earth gives its last, and you take everything it offers without guilt, without thanks, without a second thought. Because you know how winter works. You don't win, you outlast. The hearth was the heart of everything. It wasn't just for cooking, it wasn't just for warmth. In a medieval peasant's home, the hearth was the centre of survival. Small, smoky, often little more than a ring of stones with a pot forever bubbling atop it, the hearth was sacred. Not in a religious sense, though some whispered blessings over it, but in the way that everything else in life depended on it. Without fire, winter kills faster. You need it to cook. Even the simplest porridge becomes dangerous if eaten cold for too many days. You need it to keep damp from rotting your bedding, to dry out boots that have turned stiff as bark, to melt snow when the well freezes and the bucket comes up slush. But wood is not endless. In autumn, entire days were spent hauling timber, dead branches from the forest edge, twigs gathered by children, tied in bundles with frozen fingers, larger logs if you could find them or afford them. Everything dry went into the pile. Nothing was wasted. No one was too proud to burn dung if they had to. Peasants learned how to stretch the fire, how to bank the coals at night, burying them under ash to smoulder through the dark hours, ready to spark again with just a breath and a sliver of bark come dawn. Because making fire from nothing is no easy task. Flint and steel take time, effort, and dry tinder, precious in a hut where everything is damp and the walls themselves sometimes sweat. So you guard it. The oldest one in the house might sleep closest to the hearth, not for comfort, but for duty, to make sure it lives, to keep feeding it, even when her own stomach is empty. And around that fire everything gathers, the stew pot, the boots, the sick child, the hope. You don't speak much when you're near it. You listen to the crackle, to the hiss of something wet burning off, to the breath of your family, steady in sleep. The hearth isn't just a tool, it's a promise that tomorrow there will still be heat. And in a medieval winter, that alone can feel like salvation. The clothing wasn't pretty, it was protection. You didn't have a closet, you had a layer, maybe two if you were lucky. Medieval peasants didn't change outfits for the seasons, they survived them. And winter? Winter meant finding every scrap of wool, linen, hide or woven grass you owned, and turning it into armour against the cold. There was no such thing as dressing for style. There was only dressing to live. Wool was everything. Scratchy, coarse, heavy when wet, but it insulated even when damp. Peasants wore tunics that hadn't been washed properly in weeks or months, not out of neglect, but because dirt and grease made them more wind-resistant. You slept in your clothes, you cooked in them, you patched them in the dark by firelight, using bits of old yarn and whatever your fingers could still grip. Undergarments? Rare. Gloves. If you had them, they were made of rough cloth tied with twine, barely enough to protect your fingers while hauling wood or breaking ice from the water bucket. Shoes were more suggestion than solution. Most were made from thick, untreated leather or bundled cloth. They didn't keep moisture out. They didn't keep heat in. So many peasants wrapped their feet in rags and dried straw, changed them daily, or as close to daily as they could, once frostbite became more than a word and turned into a blackening truth. The trick wasn't just wearing layers, it was trapping air, keeping a buffer between you and the wind, between your skin and the world that wanted to chew through it. Children were bundled into whatever could be tied around them. Old cloaks, grain sacks, strips of fur from rabbits or even rats, sewn into sleeves or tucked behind collars. Nothing was wasted. Every scrap mattered. And if a traveller came through wearing fine wool, you didn't envy them. You watched them. Because in the middle of a brutal winter, clothing wasn't just clothing. It was the difference between waking up cold and not waking up at all. Sleeping together wasn't about affection. It was about heat. In the depths of winter, privacy wasn't a luxury, it was a myth, and nighttime, that was the most dangerous stretch of all. The hearth burned low, the wind slid through every crack in the wall, and the dark, it wasn't peaceful, it was hunting, which meant the only defense peasants had was each other. So they slept together, not in romance, not in comfort, but in necessity. Bodies pressed close, stacked like cordwood, children between adults, old ones wrapped at the centre like embers of the group. If there was straw, it was used. If there was fur, it was spread wide. If there was a dog, and there often was, it slept with the people, not beside them. One hut, one bed, if you were lucky. More often, just a broad wooden platform or the floor packed with rags and moss and last summer's hay. Everyone brought their own warmth. Everyone shared it, because alone you'd freeze. Sleep was shallow, fitful. People shifted to avoid numb limbs. coughs and dreams and snores echoed in the same breath. And no one complained, because if you had someone breathing beside you, it meant you'd both made it through another night. Sometimes the heat wasn't enough. Sometimes you'd wake and someone would be colder than they should be. Still, quiet, pale in the low firelight. That was a different kind of cold, but most nights, the collective body heat, muffled under cloaks and scraps and wet wool, did its job. Even strangers were pulled in. A traveller who helped chop wood that afternoon. A girl who'd come from the next village to barter for salted meat. No questions asked, just space made. Because heat was survival, and survival didn't care whose name you knew. Later, in spring, when the sun returned, everyone would return to their own corners. But in winter, the rules changed, and the only walls that mattered were warm ones made of flesh and breath. The animal was part of the house, not beside it, not behind it, inside it. In the dead of winter, peasants didn't just live with their animals, they shared the same space, under the same sagging roof, breathing the same smoky air. Not because it was pleasant, but because it worked. Cows gave heat, so did pigs, so did chickens, goats and sheep. A warm body is a warm body, and in a thatched hut where the wind slides through the walls like a thief, every heartbeat helps. Most peasant homes were built as longhouses, half for people, half for livestock. A low wooden barrier, maybe a partition of woven twigs or boards if you had time, separated the family from the animals. But the air, that was shared. At night, the cow's breath steamed like a second fire. The pigs rooted beneath their straw, grunting softly. The chickens tucked their heads beneath their wings, clustered for warmth, feathers fluttering with every movement. You got used to the smells, to the noises, to the constant sense that the house was not fully yours, that you were borrowing warmth from something that would be slaughtered in spring, and that closeness, it kept you alive. Children leaned against the sheepdog. Elders cupped their hands over the soft belly of a goat. A pig might snore louder than a man, but no one ever pushed it away, because each one was a little furnace, a quiet, four-legged fire, one that didn't burn out at midnight. Of course there were risks, fleas, bites, illness, the stink of it all, but the line between man and animal blurred in winter, not because peasants were primitive, but because they were practical. You survived with what you had. And if what you had was a cow standing 6 feet from your child's cradle, then that cow became kin for the season. Spring would come. The barn would be rebuilt. The animals would return to the field. But in winter, the beasts were not outside. They were family. They were warmth. They were life. Food wasn't eaten. It was stretched in winter. Meals weren't moments of comfort, they were equations. You looked at your stores, counted the dried peas, the sacks of rye, the last salted fish hanging by the fire. Then you did math, not with numbers but with days, with bellies, with hours of light and cold left before spring. And then you stretched. The first rule of winter survival, make everything last longer than it should. That meant eating less, watering down more, turning scraps into soup and bones into something. Pottage was the backbone, a bubbling, ever-changing stew that never truly emptied. Grains, roots, herbs, and whatever else was edible, or close to it. You'd eat from the same pot all week, adding as you went, the flavour deepening and darkening like the sky outside. Meat, rare. Salt pork from a pig slaughtered in autumn. Dried fish from the last river catch. If you were lucky, you'd slice it thin and let it flavour the broth, not fill the bowl. A hint was enough. The idea of meat, not its reality. Rats and mice were not delicacies, but they were used. So were crows. So were songbirds. You plucked feathers with numb fingers and gave thanks, not apologies. Bread became thinner, oats became porridge, and porridge became everything. You didn't eat until full. You ate until the shivering slowed. Children were taught early, don't ask for more. Take what's warm. Keep your portion small, your hands steady. If there's a guest, feed them first. They might trade something later. And when the food truly ran out, you scraped bark from trees, boiled moss, ground acorns into flour, so bitter it made your teeth ache, but better than silence. Famine wasn't always a scream. Sometimes it was a whisper, a bowl with just a little less than yesterday, and still you endured, because every spoonful brought you one day closer to green shoots, to sunlight, to something sweet again. In winter, food wasn't pleasure, it was strategy, and you didn't feast to survive. You tightened. The ice was not beautiful, it was a threat poets love. To describe winter ice like it's made of glass, like it's delicate, romantic, shimmering. But to a medieval peasant, ice was not a decoration. It was danger. The kind that crept in overnight and didn't leave until it had taken something from you. It started with the well. One morning the bucket wouldn't drop, or it would, but the water would come up locked in a crust. So you learned to break it. A stick, a stone. Your own hands if need be. Then wait, watch, listen for the slosh that meant life could go on. But not all water lived in wells. Streams froze, fountains stilled, gutters cracked, and when your thatch roof gave way to a slow drip of freezing water, you didn't curse the weather. You cursed your own delay. You should have patched it in August. You should have checked the moss. Now, it was too late. Inside the house, ice was worse. It crawled down the walls, formed in corners, turned your breath into clouds thick enough to feel. You touched your bowl and your fingers stung. The wooden spoon left your lips numb. Water spilled on the floor didn't dry. It stayed, sharp, silent, waiting for someone's bare foot to find it at dawn. Clothes froze overnight. So did shoes. So did boots if they were left too close to the wall. You'd wake to find them stiff as boards, impossible to bend without splitting the seams. And the worst ice, the one in your own lungs. Cold air, breathed too fast, could burn, could seize, could freeze the phlegm in your chest into something that choked you when you tried to speak. Children coughed until they cried. Elders wheezed without sleep. Every breath was a gamble. Still, ice was everywhere. It couldn't be fought, only respected. You learned its patterns, its rhythms. You moved slower on steps. You banked the fire higher when it clung to the windows. You thanked the sheepdog for sleeping on your feet and not by the door, because winter didn't need a storm to kill you. It only needed silence, and time, and just enough cold water left unwatched. Tools were treasures and lifelines. A knife wasn't just a knife, it was firewood, it was supper, it was survival. In the brutal winters of medieval life, your tools weren't possessions. They were companions, trusted, treasured, and in many cases passed down through generations like relics. The axe was sacred. It split the logs, cut the branches, carved the stakes that reinforced the hut against the wind. It wasn't polished or balanced or beautiful. It was chipped and heavy and repaired more times than you could count. But you didn't curse it. You talked to it, quietly, under your breath, like you would to an old friend too tired to lift itself, but too loyal to leave you cold. The sickle still hung on the wall, even in snow. It wouldn't touch grain again until spring, but it might be used to clear brambles or hack through frozen brush for firewood or fodder. Ropes were checked nightly. Frayed ones could break under snow weight. They tied down thatched roofing, held closed warped doors, lashed cloaks in place when the wind wouldn't stop howling. No rope meant exposure. No exposure meant breath. It was that simple. Needles were magic. Because when your coat tore or your boot gave way at the seam, you couldn't buy a new one. You mended. With coarse thread, with strips of old cloth, with anything you could twist through a hole. Some tools weren't metal, a smooth stone for grinding, a sharpened bone for stitching, even a good stick, used to prod the fire or break ice at the edge of the well, could feel like a blessing in your hand. Losing a tool in winter, it wasn't just inconvenience, it was risk. A snapped axe handle could mean no fire. A dull knife could mean spoiled meat. A missing pot hook meant no stew that night. So you cared for them, sharpened what could be sharpened, wrapped what could be wrapped, and when one broke, you didn't throw it away. You buried it, because some things didn't just help you survive, they kept you human. Smoke wasn't just a nuisance, it was a shield. It stung your eyes, clung to your clothes, settled into your skin like a second layer, but smoke, choking, sour, endless, kept you alive. In the dead of winter, every medieval peasant's home carried the smell of it, not because they wanted to, but because they had to. There were no chimneys, at least not for most, not for peasants. Smoke vented through a hole in the roof or a crack in the wall, or simply filled the room until it seeped out through the thatch. You coughed, you squinted, you lived in it. But in that haze, something important happened. Smoke preserved. It clung to meat, rabbit, fish, pork, hanging above the hearth. Not sizzling, but slowly, slowly drying into something that might last another week, another month. You didn't eat for flavor. You ate for storage. And smoke did something else too, something almost magical. It kept the cold out. Thick air held heat better than clean air. It wrapped around you like a woolen fog, kept the chill from settling too deep in your bones. It made the air feel heavy, but warm. And in a one-room hut with only one source of fire, that mattered more than comfort. Smoke kept bugs away, kept rats from nesting in the rafters, kept sickness from spreading. At least, that's what people believed. And belief in winter is almost as important as truth. Children crawled close to the hearth, their eyes red, their noses running. They didn't complain. They knew what the smoke meant, that the fire still burned, that the stew still bubbled, that home still existed. And when you stepped outside, into the wind, into the snow, into the silence, you came back with your hair frozen, but you smelled of smoke, and that meant you belonged somewhere. Somewhere warm, somewhere hard, somewhere alive. The church bell was the sound of survival. In the depth of a medieval winter, sound travelled differently. The snow hushed everything. Voices got swallowed. Steps disappeared. The wind spoke in long, low howls that filled the gaps between houses and made even the bravest men pause. But when the church bell rang, everyone listened. It wasn't just for prayer. It was a signal, a call, a pulse through the cold that meant someone still had enough strength, or warmth, or faith to ring it. Most villages had a bell, even the poor ones, hung from a crude belfry or tied to a rope in the rafters. And in winter, that bell could mean anything. Sometimes it marked the hour, or tried to. Most peasants couldn't tell time with any accuracy, but the bell gave rhythm to the day. Morning bell meant stir the ashes and check the well. Noon bell meant eat, if there's anything to eat. Evening bell meant bring the animals in, bar the door, bank the fire. But other times, the bell rang fast, sharp, frantic. That meant trouble. Someone missing, a roof collapsed, a sickness spreading, a wolf near the edge of the village. Sometimes it rang slow, one deep tone every few minutes. That meant death. Someone had passed. Not that anyone needed reminding, winter death left a mark. A cart parked outside a hut, a patch of dug-up snow, a silence thicker than usual. Still, the bell tolled, because sound brings order, and order in a world frozen stiff and ruled by wind is everything. Even when you couldn't reach the church, even when snowdrifts buried the path, you listened, you stopped, you counted the rings, and you prayed, if not to God, then to spring. The fool once joked that the bell was like a stubborn old man, always shouting, always late, but somehow still keeping everyone alive. No one laughed that day, because when the bell rings in winter, it means someone is still ringing it, and that means hope hasn't frozen over yet. Illness didn't knock. It crept in. It started small, a cough in the middle of the night, a pale face at dawn, someone rubbing their chest, their breath coming slower than it should. No one said the word aloud. Not at first, because in winter sickness wasn't a visitor, it was a thief. One that slipped beneath doors, rode in on smoke, curled up beside you when the fire dimmed and you were too tired to push it away. The peasant home had no medicine chest, no healer with clean tools, just a few old herbs hanging in the rafters, if they hadn't rotted in the damp, and whatever memory your grandmother had passed down. Willow bark for pain, nettle for fever, a hot stone wrapped in cloth to press against the chest, chicken broth if you had a chicken, honey and vinegar if you hadn't traded them away. But truthfully, you hoped, you waited, you watched. Because once illness took root in a hut that held 8 people in one door, it was hard to stop. There were no clean sheets, no quarantine. If one fell sick, the rest leaned in, cared for them, sweated with them, sang over them, sometimes in low tones meant more for themselves than the dying. And still, many recovered. That was the miracle. Not because they were strong, but because they were together. Warmth was shared, so was broth, so was silence. The old prayed, the young tended. The fool told gentle stories and rubbed garlic onto the walls, just in case. But when death came, it came fast. Sometimes you woke to find someone still, too still. A child who no longer stirred. A brother whose breathing had stopped. No screaming, just cold. The body was wrapped, carried, buried if the ground would let you dig. Sometimes you had to wait. Keep them in the farthest corner, under cloth, until the thaw. And then you swept the floor, you stoked the fire, and you went on. Because in winter you didn't fight death. You endured it. The silence could be louder than the storm. Not every winter night was violent. Sometimes there was no wind, no snow, no sound at all. Just stillness, cold and perfect. So quiet that your own breath sounded wrong. These were the nights peasants feared most, because silence wasn't peace, it was a pause. The world holding its breath. When there was a storm you could prepare, tie things down, block the door, feed the fire, brace the walls. Storms made you act, but silence, it made you wait. The kind of wait that cracked your nerves open. You lay awake, eyes wide in the dark, counting every creak of wood, every shuffle from the animal side of the hut. Was that the wind? Or footsteps? Ice shifting? Or something worse? Children whimpered in their sleep. Dogs growled low, uncertain. Even the fool didn't speak, because silence makes everything louder. Your hunger, your grief, your fear. It was in these moments that stories were whispered, not to entertain, but to fill the air. Tales of spirits that wandered the snow, tapping on windows, looking for a warm place to rest. Of wolves that walked on 2 legs. Of women in white who came only when the sky was too clear. You didn't believe them. Not entirely, but you also didn't speak them too loud, because winter listens. And silence in these parts is never empty, so you did what you could, banked the coals, covered the children, placed a knife near the door, not for intruders, but for comfort, sat with your back to the wall and your face to the fire, and waited. Waited for dawn, for birdsong, for anything that reminded you the world hadn't frozen entirely. And when morning finally broke and frost laced the window and your joints ached from stillness, you exhaled, because you'd survived not just the cold, but the quiet. Community wasn't a choice, it was a lifeline. In spring, you might argue with your neighbour. In summer, you might pretend not to see them. But in winter, you needed them. Community wasn't about friendship in the Middle Ages, it was about function. In the coldest months, no peasant survived alone, not for long. If your firewood ran low, someone shared a bundle. If your child grew sick, someone brought honey or broth. If your roof caved in, someone showed up with a hammer and a prayer. Not because they liked you, because they'd need you too. The social contract in a medieval village was written in frost and ash. People remembered kindnesses and remembered debts even more. They watched, quietly. They knew who fed the widow next door, who helped bury the baby when the earth was too hard to dig, who shared a cloak when the firewood ran out. Those were the people you trusted. And the ones who kept to themselves, the ones who had full stores but never shared, whose chimneys smoked warm but who never answered the door. They were remembered too, in silence, in distance. Sometimes the fool would make jokes about them, harmless ones on the surface, but everyone heard the truth beneath the rhyme, because jokes like favours had weight in winter. So did songs. Peasants sang together, not for celebration but to stay awake, during long nights of watch, during endless days of mending and threshing and waiting. One voice became 2, became 10. It kept rhythm, kept warmth, kept the cold from crawling too far into the soul. No one talked about love, but they showed up. They shared what they could, and when they couldn't, they sat beside you, so at least you were cold together. And that was the secret of medieval winter. You didn't survive because you were strong. You survived because you weren't alone. Time was counted in shadows and stomachs, no clocks, no calendars. Just sky, ache, and instinct. In the middle of a medieval winter, time wasn't tracked. It was endured. The sun rose late, low and grey. Barely enough light to call it morning. Sometimes the clouds never lifted at all, and it felt like the day had been skipped completely. Night came too early. Darkness didn't knock. It settled, folding over the village like a second roof. So peasants learned to tell time by other means, by the position of the shadows on the floor, if the fire was strong enough to cast any, by the rhythm of hunger, by the weight of silence in the room. Morning was when you stirred the ashes. Midday was when you dared a second meal. Night came when the last piece of firewood had been spent and the dog stopped pacing. And in between, there was only waiting, waiting on a thaw, for a noise outside, for spring. Seasons were lived, not measured. You didn't say January, you said after the third snow, or before the well froze last year. Time stretched out like wool pulled too thin. Hours bled together. Sometimes the only difference between Monday and Friday was whether the soup still had meat in it. Children grew during winter, and you hardly noticed until their boots no longer fit. Old ones faded slowly, one cough at a time, and still, you moved forward. Winter wasn't a single season. It was a string of endless repeating days, each one slightly colder, slightly darker, slightly heavier than the last. But even then, peasants found markers, a feast day, a neighbour's birthday, the first clear morning when birds sang again. These were the punctuation marks in the long sentence of survival. And when you saw the first green bud on a tree, it didn't feel like spring, it felt like relief, because time hadn't passed. It had spared you. Faith wasn't just religion, it was resistance. In the deep heart of winter, when the world turned quiet and cruel, people didn't just rely on fire and food, they relied on faith. Not always in the church, not always in saints, but in something. For some it was God, a carved cross over the door, a whispered prayer before breaking bread, a line from scripture muttered while lighting the fire, not out of habit, but out of hope. Because when your world is one room, one fire, and one meal from ruin, the idea that something greater might be watching is more than comforting. It's necessary. But faith came in other forms too, in charms, bundles of herbs hung from beams, bits of iron buried near doorposts, old runes scratched into the sides of spoons or stitched into the hem of a cloak. They weren't holy exactly, they were just old, passed down, worn smooth by belief. The fool, of course, had his own rituals. He'd toss salt into the fire and say it was to keep the wind from stealing your dreams. He'd spit on a coin before giving it away. He'd tell stories of angels and demons hiding in frost patterns on the window. Not because he believed them, but because you did. Even those who claimed no faith still made offerings, a crust of bread left outside, for the dead. A candle lit on the coldest night, not for warmth but for memory, because winter reminded you how small you were, and in that smallness, belief became armor. You told yourself spring would come, that the pigs would survive, that your child's fever would break, that the snow would melt and the world would green again. Maybe it was superstition, maybe it was foolishness, but maybe it was resistance, because to believe in something during winter was to defy the cold with your will. And sometimes that was the only warmth you had left. Stories were more than entertainment, they were shelter. There's a moment, just before the coals fade, when everyone leans a little closer. The room is dim. The children have stopped fidgeting. The stew pot is empty, scraped clean, and the only thing left to feed is the mind. So the stories begin. Not read from books, there were none. Not recited from scrolls or pages, just spoken, remembered, woven from old breath and older memory. These weren't bedtime tales, they were barriers, against cold, against fear, against the long, dark silence of winter that presses on your ribs like a second hunger. The fool always had one ready, usually something absurd, a rooster who outwits a bishop, a cat who steals a saint's boots, a farmer who marries a ghost. Everyone laughed. Not because they believed, but because it was easier to laugh than to count the days left till thaw. And then someone else would add a line, and another, and before long the room was warmer, not in temperature, but in spirit, because storytelling was heat of a different kind. It reminded you who you were, who came before, that you weren't the first to suffer, to hunger, to pray for sun, that others had survived and remembered. The best stories were strange, twisted, comforting in their weirdness. They had rules no one questioned and morals no one followed, but they worked. They gave shape to darkness, names to fear, purpose to pain, and when they ended, it didn't matter that you still had another hour of cold ahead, or another 4 weeks before the road to the next village would open again. What mattered was that your breath had joined the circle, that your voice had added something to the flame, and maybe, when spring came, someone would remember your story, repeat it, and in that way you'd survive again. The dead we were laid near, but never left alone. In spring, a death meant a burial, a procession, a patch of blessed earth, a handful of prayers, and then life moved on. But in winter, the ground was too hard, the spade couldn't bite, the earth simply refused. So when someone passed in the heart of the cold, the village did what it had to do, what it had always done. They waited. The body was wrapped, carefully, in cloth if there was enough, in fur if they could spare it. The hands were folded, the eyes closed, a coin placed over each lid, not for payment, but for weight, to keep the lids from drifting open in the dark. And then the body stayed, not outside, not in the church, but near, sometimes in a shed, sometimes beneath the floorboards, sometimes in the coldest corner of the same hut where life continued on. It was a quiet companionship. No one spoke to the dead, but no one ignored them either. A bowl of broth might be placed nearby, not as a meal, but as a gesture, a sign that they were still part of the home, still remembered, still anchored, because the worst thing wasn't death, it was being forgotten. And in winter, remembrance was resistance. You didn't fear the dead. You feared what forgetting them meant, that you were alone, that no one would do the same for you. Children learned early to walk carefully around the place where the body rested, not out of fear, but respect. The fool would sometimes sing under his breath when he passed that corner, a lullaby, a rhyme, something soft and shapeless, and when the thaw came, when the soil softened, when the birds returned, when the worms began to stir again, the dead were carried out, not with grief, but with relief, and laid gently into the earth, not buried alone, but carried through winter by the ones they left behind. The thaw was feared almost as much as the frost. You'd think the first melt would bring joy, hope, relief. But in a medieval winter, when the frost finally loosened its grip, no one celebrated. Not at first, because the thaw was dangerous. It came quietly, drips from the eaves, a softness in the wind, mud where there had only been iron. The snow turned slush, and the fields, long silent, began to smell. And that's when the real trouble started. The roads collapsed. The bridges, if they hadn't been swept away by winter's ice, buckled under the weight of melt. The thatched roofs, wet and sagging, began to drip through cracks that had stayed hidden under frost. Every wall leaned a little more. The food stores that had held up all winter, now they rotted, fast. Grain turned sour. Roots grew mould. Barrels of salted meat wept salt water and began to stink. Rats, bold from hunger, gnawed through corners and left filth in their wake. Diseases came out of hiding. Coughs worsened. Wounds that hadn't healed turned black. A fever passed from one hut to another like smoke, but worse, because this smoke you couldn't see. The ground, still too wet to work, offered no help. And those few who had survived the cold, thin, trembling, hopeful, sometimes fell before spring even fully arrived. Not from frost, but from what the frost had hidden. The fool said it best: winter kills quickly, spring kills slow. So the thaw was met with caution. People didn't throw open doors, they cracked them, peeked out, walked softly across the ground as though it might still collapse under them. And when the sun came for more than just an hour, when the birds didn't just visit, but stayed, when the first green blade of grass pushed through without shriveling in the night, then and only then did people breathe differently, not with joy, with permission, because survival wasn't measured in the thaw itself, but in what you still had left when it came. The return of the birds meant everything. It was small at first, a single chirp, high and sharp, carried on cold air like something lost. You paused, one hand still in the snow, the other wrapped in a torn mitten, and listened. There it was again. A bird. In winter, birds disappeared, gone south, gone quiet, gone dead. You didn't see them, you didn't hear them, you forgot what wings looked like. And then, suddenly, they were back. Crows came first, black and bold, picking through the slush, then robins, then wrens, A soft flurry of wings on the thatch. A scratchy little song, not beautiful, just alive. Peasants mark the moment. They always did. Because birds meant thaw, birds meant bugs, birds meant the world had not ended, not entirely. Children pointed and whispered like they were seeing angels. Old women crossed themselves. Young men tilted their heads like trying to understand a language they'd once spoken but had forgotten over too many dark months. Even the fool went quiet. He'd once said that the birds were souls sent to scout ahead of spring, that they came to check if the humans were still here, if the fires still burned, if the bodies had outlasted the silence. No one laughed, because when you heard that song again, the first in what felt like years, it stirred something inside you that had frozen too deep to touch. It reminded you of green, of soft things, of milk, of laughter, of hope. That day, someone opened a shutter, not all the way, just a crack, and the room, still damp and smelling of old stew, filled with something sharp and cold and new. The birds didn't stay long at first, just a few brave ones, but they were enough to say, you made it. Not everyone had, but you had, and maybe, just maybe the world was turning again. Survival wasn't glory, it was endurance. There were no celebrations, no bonfires, no dancing, no great feasts to mark the end of winter. Spring didn't arrive with fanfare. It crept in on tired feet, a patch of soft mud where ice had ruled, the first green blade pushing through thawed earth, a calf born early and alive, a cough that finally quieted, a silence that felt less like waiting and more like breathing. For the medieval peasant, surviving winter wasn't triumph, it was barely enough. You didn't step into spring with pride, you limped toward it, hollow-eyed and aching, with fewer teeth than before and fewer names at the fire. But you stepped into it. That was the point. There was wood to gather, fields to turn, roofs to mend, food to hunt, dig, grow. No time to reflect, no space for ceremony. Yet beneath the grind there was something sacred. You had made it. That meant something. It meant your fire never died. Your hands never stopped moving. Your body kept heat just long enough to outlast the cold. And more than that, so did your will. Some didn't. They were buried at last with proper rites in soil finally soft enough to open. Their names were whispered, then folded into memory. Life made room for their absence, like a bed reshaped after someone rises. And the fool? He stood at the edge of the thawed path, tapping a stick in the mud, smiling just a little. Back to it then, he said, as if survival had been a pause, as if work was a comfort, as if spring had always been waiting for you to finish the story. There were no trophies, only seeds to plant, and one more winter ahead, waiting someday to be outlived again. So now the snow has melted, the fires burned low, and we've reached the end of the long cold road. But for the medieval peasant, there was never really an end to winter. Only a pause, a brief breath of warmth before the cold returned, because survival wasn't a destination. It was a habit, a rhythm, a kind of quiet defiance lived out in wool and ash and silence. They didn't write their stories down. They left no statues, no glory, no songs sung in cathedrals, but they survived, with aching fingers, with borrowed fire, with scraps of food and worn-out shoes and hope held together by threadbare cloth. And maybe, just maybe, there's something in that kind of survival we can still learn from. So if you're still here, thank you. Let me know in the comments where you're listening from, and what the weather is like right now. I find it strangely comforting to picture people all over the world drifting off to sleep to the same slow story, warmed by the same ancient memory of endurance. And if this kind of calm, quiet history brought you peace, consider liking the video and subscribing. Not because the algorithm says so, but because it helps build a small, gentle corner of the internet where stories like this can live. Until next time, keep the fire close, keep the blankets tight, and remember, even the longest winters eventually pass. Sleep well. You made it.